Welcome to Robertson Genis Live, this time for April the 2nd in the year of our Lord 2025. So glad you could be with us today. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And in my role as host of this program, I will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, tradition, scripture, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the saints, the doctors, the theologians, the catechisms, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And usually at the top of the program, we have some email questions to answer and maybe some other topics that have come up during the week. And we do have some today, so I will spend a good part of the opening in answer to those questions. And let me see here. What shall we start with first? Someone wrote in, oh, by the way, I just want to let you know, we did have our conference in Washakie, Wisconsin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Please don't be offended if I'm not, and you live there, right outside of Milwaukee. And it was a very good conference. We had over 300 people. And we covered creation, the flood, geocentrism, and aliens, believe it or not. So we're going to have another one, I think, either next year or the year after, probably in Florida, they tell me. So we'll wait and see. But I hope I'm still living by that time. At any rate, I just wanted to let you know that that was accomplished, and I would assume they're going to put it on streaming or whatever media they can find that works, so that those of you who weren't privileged to come will be able to see it eventually on the internet. Okay, so someone wrote in regarding a book that was written by, what is her name? Ali Bonner. Ali spelled A-L-I like Muhammad Ali. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Ali Bonner. And so I watched the video, and her specialty, well, she's a historian. I don't know whether she's Catholic or not. She probably is either Anglican or Catholic, but that didn't come out in the video. So I don't know offhand, but that's probably better that we don't sort of categorize her. Let's just take her for what she says and go from there. She wrote a book recently, I think last year, was it, called The Myth of Pelagianism. The Myth of Pelagianism. Now, already your hackles are getting up, right? Because the church has condemned Pelagianism, even condemned semi-Pelagianism. The Council of Carthage did that, and Pope Zosimus did that as well. So, but the person who read the book thought she had some important things to say, and I promised I would look at it and comment on it, which I did to him personally, but I also think it's important for our audience to see what's out there and to be able to dissect it and see if there's any good that can come from it. Now, she is of the opinion, Ali is of the opinion that Pelagius got a bad rap, that he was sort of tossed around back and forth between people and wasn't given a fair shake, is what I am assessing from her. Again, this is from The Myth of Pelagianism by Ali Bonner, Bonner. You could probably find a copy of it on Amazon. So I'm not going to go too long and hard into this, because these kinds of discussions, as you may know, take time. Because whenever you talk about predestination and free will, every man and their uncle has an opinion of how it fits together. Some more on the predestination side, some more on the free will side. And it's never been resolved in the church, and it's never going to be resolved, because we just don't have the, I don't know if it takes intelligence or not. Probably it takes, definitely takes intelligence, reasoning ability. But it's just one of those things that it's like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit against the other puzzle piece. It may look like it fits, but it's pretty hard to put it together. Let's just put it this way. No one's come up with a invincible explanation of how they both fit together. Okay. I had a dream about this last night, believe it or not. And as a matter of fact, I need to keep dreaming about that because I didn't finish my dream. Let me write that down here, because I had some more thoughts on how to combine these two. And I was suddenly woken up from my dream, so I couldn't finish it. Anyway, one of her comments during the interview, because there was this man, what's his name? Warren. Well, I wrote it down. Sorry. Well, I can't see it in my notes here right now. But he was interviewing her, and she's a very articulate woman. She knows a lot of good history, especially British Catholic history, back in the time of Augustine. And I think one of her statements that she made sort of spilled the beans for me, which was that she believes in her heart that there has to be some, what she called, autonomy for man in order to decide for God. Now, when she says autonomy, she's saying it's like she's saying there's 99% of it that's from God, but there's this 1% that's from man. It's autonomous, that doesn't involve God, that she believes Pelagius had hit upon, and thus preserves a genuine free will for man. Okay. So it really doesn't matter whether you say 90% is for God and 10% is for man, or 99.99% is for God and 0.01 is for man. It really doesn't matter. Once you open that door where you say that man's free will is separate from God in any way so that he can make a single decision, a autonomous decision apart from God for his salvation. And that's kind of ironic because you have free will to come to God for salvation, so he's giving you everything. But there's this one little percent, that we don't want to give to God. And so that's basically where Pelagius was coming from. And often he is saddled with, or you say categorized with, the idea that man has an innate ability to do good. An innate. And again, that's a word that means it's in him alone. And I guess you would say that God gave it to him. The innate ability to do good without being moved by God in some sense. Okay. And again, it doesn't matter which percentage you want to put on that. How much innate ability do I have? Doesn't really matter. Once you say you even have 1% or 0.5%, you're into a whole different territory. And Augustine, who used to be, prior to his very strong predestinarian stance, used to be a free will man in his theology, much more inclined to free will. And then as he went on, he tightened that up a lot with his stance on predestination. Now, Augustine never explained how you're going to combine free will with predestination. I'm not saying he went that far. What I'm saying is he shifted from his free will emphasis, let's say, to a more predestinarian. Okay. And it's not that Pelagius didn't talk about predestination. He just wanted this 1% or whatever you want to call it, where man makes the decision so that we give man a genuine, uncoerced free will. Free will is a tricky thing because, as Augustine said to his people, when he's quoting Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:7, I think he says, he's quoting Paul, which says, "What do you have that's yours? Everything you have is a gift of God," he told the Corinthians. Paul did. And Augustine used that verse many, many times. And getting the idea across that you can't claim anything for yourself. Everything comes from God, including your ability to decide, including your free will. So if that's the case, then since that is the case, we should say, we can see why Augustine landed more on the predestination side than he did the free will side. Now, I'm not saying Augustine is right, okay? Because if you're going to have the theological audacity, I would say, to say, well, let's not worry about it. It's really predestination. And we really don't know how your free will comes in there, but it's still sort of engulfed by, predestination. Then you're not given a fair shake to free will. Okay. Thomas Aquinas, he's guilty of the same thing. And I'm not the only one who says this about him. It's all wrapped up in the cause and effect kind of thing where everything's already calculated and nothing's going to change. And so free will becomes like an artifact. Okay. An artifact is something that doesn't have an ontological existence in itself. It's just the result of what appears to be the case. And it doesn't stand by itself. Okay. So that's the problem, is, are you allowed to do that with free will, where it's just an after effect, sort of a consequence. Yeah, we'll give you free will, but it's really not the mover and the shaker. It's the predestination that's the mover and the shaker. And predestination sort of engulfs free will. And the best descriptions we have, let's say, of the Catechism did a pretty good job, I thought. The 1997 Catechism said in paragraph 600 that man has a free will, and that God's predestination plan incorporates the free response of man. And that's pretty fair. But even then, you have predestination being the overarching rule of theology, and free will has to somehow fit in there, you see. So is free will getting a fair shake in the theological arena where these two things are battling it out? Okay. And I think you can judge a theologian's fairness in the theology based on that, based on the idea, are you giving a fair shake to free will, or are you just treating it like an artifact of predestination? And there the discussion has remained for many years and has not really advanced. And again, it's because of the nature of the beast. It's very difficult to put those things together. So some people have even tried to whittle down predestination in order to make it fit. Like some will say, well, God didn't predestinate individuals, he predestinated the plan of salvation. And in that sense, you take away the specificity of it. It becomes diluted, so that now you can fit free will, a genuine free will, into the formula, into the equation, and it makes it easier. So, and the other thing is, Ali Bonner, as most scholars are, they're very liberal. And you cannot get away from that label in today's climate between theologians, because liberals have a tendency to say, well, the way we saw it before isn't exactly right, so we need to tweak it a little bit, or tweak it a lot. And they end up, and as a matter of fact, one time she says, can we change doctrine? Can we modify doctrine if we have new insights in the future? Now, you would figure, say, we're 2,000 years away from Jesus. If there's going to be any modification, we probably are closer to it in our day than they were, say, in the year 1000, because things have developed. Our minds and understanding of things have definitely matured, okay? But, and so you're tempted with that question sometimes. Can we modify doctrine because of these new things, new insights that we have, okay? Now, the liberal will usually raise his hand. Yes, we do. We can change doctrine. And they don't mean, just haphazard changes, of course. They mean that, look, they're men just like we are. And if we don't see things exactly correctly, well, what about them? They're not immune from it. These men were not filled with the Spirit of God in the sense that whatever they wrote down is, automatically correct. Okay. But yeah, that goes so far. But in the area of dogma, and this is where she's really trying to dig a hole in the area of dogma, and it would be hard to say, however, that the Catholic Church has a infallible dogma about predestination and free will. You see, that's what's going to make this a little edgy. We have a doctrine about the Trinity and the Incarnation and, Mary's Assumption and, all that. And they're all fine and dandy. Even today, we still argue about those a little bit, but we shouldn't, because they're dogma. They're not going to change. But when we get into this area of predestination and free will, we do have certain statements made by the church, but one of them, like from the Council of Valence or Trullo, these were local councils. Okay, so even the Council of Trent doesn't talk about predestination, at least in any kind of definitive, this is it kind of explanation, and don't go to any other. And so we got the closest one in Augustine's time was the Council of Orange, again, another local council. Even the Council of Carthage that had condemned Pelagius. That was a local council. Okay. So, it's hard to find those definitive statements by the church concerning how predestination fits in with free will. We had the time where the Molinists were fighting the Thomists, and was it Pius V said, look, we're not getting anywhere. Let's stop, and we'll regroup sometime in the future. So, this is one of those things. But, Pelagius was condemned. He was given a, what do they call that? Honorius gave him an imperial rescript, which condemned him. Zosimus was fighting back and forth, and I think it was Honorius who sort of convinced Zosimus that, you need to come down harder on Pelagius. And probably for the reasons that I said, which is if Pelagius is teaching we have an innate ability to do good without the grace of God, you're off track. Okay. So Augustine's big thing was, look, I can't tell you how it happens, but I can tell you this, that your free will is not autonomous. Your free will is given to you by the grace of God. That's where it all starts. And then even to come to the point where you're going to make a decision, that's all led by grace, which we call prevenient grace. Okay. And even the point where you come to the point where you are coming to the point that you're going to use your free will, that's all by grace. So everything starts by grace. And then Augustine would say, after that, yes, you have a free will in the purest sense to go and make a decision. Now, he's not going to explain how that happens in light of predestination. Don't go to Augustine for that, or anybody for that matter. The issue at the fore here is, does the grace come before the free will? Augustine says yes, definitely, and Pelagius is saying no. Okay, so with that in the background, there's not much that Miss Bonner is going to change. Okay, the church has already been definitive about that, and even though Augustine he went back and forth on this. When he's talking to one group, he's like more predestinarian. When he's talking to the other group, he's more free will. Augustine at times is all over the map. Okay. But in the end, he comes down and says, Pelagius, you're wrong because grace comes before free will. And, you have to live with that. There was a guy during his day, he didn't become a saint. His name is John Cassian. And Cassian saw the debates between Augustine and Pelagius, Augustine and Julian. Augustine and Julian really went at it back and forth. And they ended up calling each other names, and not so good names. Again, heated battles because nobody is really able to put their finger on it and say, okay, here's the definitive answer. Okay. So as Catholics, what do? We believe in both predestination. That's not a John Calvin doctrine. That's a Catholic doctrine. John Calvin got it from us. As a matter of fact, John Calvin got it from Augustine. Okay. And probably a little from Aquinas. That's a Catholic doctrine, predestination. How we understand predestination, okay, that's where the church needs a little bit more work. Okay. Because it's one thing to talk about the label predestination. It's quite another to understand what it is, how it functions, how it works as free will, and all that. And you're going to find few people in the Catholic Church who even can touch the issue, much less explain it. So, as a matter of fact, it wasn't only Julian, it was Jerome. Jerome was saying things against Augustine's view. Ambrose also, Athanasius, Augustine stood out. And that's, it's why one of the reasons why the church looks to him so heavily. He did stand out. And there has to be a good reason for it. And in those areas, he was a good thinker, you see. So anyway, I just figured I'd let that out. I'll probably write something up on that. I don't know. Then somebody asked me, this is a biggie. Somebody sent me a video where a guy named, is it J. Dyer or Joe Dyer? J. Dyer, I think, D-Y-E-R. And he made a video about, 40 minutes or so, 5 months ago. I hadn't seen it. And someone brought it to my attention and asked me what I thought of it. And so I watched it, and I don't think too highly of it. So the reason is J. Dyer, as I understand, is not a Catholic. He's a Protestant of some sort. I don't know if he's Anglican or what, but he's got it against the papacy. And so he starts attacking the consistency or lack thereof of the church's teaching. And he said, and I think the video is titled, "This is the one thing that contradicts the Catholic Church," or something. I forget what the exact title is. But he's making a full case on this one thing he has discovered wherein the church contradicts itself, and therefore you shouldn't be following the Catholic Church. And I guess his logic is if there's one thing, then it doesn't really matter what's after that. If she contradicts herself in one thing, then she's going to do it in other things, which is implied, and therefore don't bother with the Catholic Church. And I think it's pretty grievous because as intelligent as he sounds, he's just way off target. Just way off target. He's making up things from things he's read in the church and making his own conclusions and builds a straw man that he can beat up all by himself. And if I had the YouTube reference here, I do have it, but invariably, if I tried to give that to you, because I can't put it on the screen. All right, somebody said he's Orthodox. Okay. All right, so thank you for that. He starts off with, he attacks a lot of older documents, in particular Unum Sanctum, written by Boniface VIII in 1302. And he starts talking about the fact that Boniface is teaching that the Pope has spiritual power and temporal power. And the end sentence of the paragraphs written by Boniface say, where is it? Okay. Furthermore, we declare, say, define, and proclaim to every human creature that they, by necessity for salvation, are entirely subject to the Roman pontiff. So he uses that as sort of his clincher to say, well, since Boniface declares himself a spiritual leader and a temporal leader, and what he ends up saying about the temporalness is like it's geopolitical, he's in charge of all the emperors and the kings and blah, blah, blah. It makes it sound like he has 12 hours he works as Pope and 12 hours he works like a temporal authority over all the other authorities. That's the way he makes it sound. But when you read Boniface VIII's description of what he means by temporal, it's exactly what you and I would think, which is he goes no further than to say that the spiritual power that he has is over the temporal, in the sense that he is the guide, he's the moral guide, he's the judge of whatever they have done in their countries, king, potentate, or president, is right or wrong. Okay, that's all Boniface VIII is talking about insofar as his temporal power. Not that he is, 24/7, communicating with the president of Russia or something and telling him, you ought to do this for your people and you ought to do that and this and the other thing. The Pope could care less. Well, not care less, but he's just not interested in that. It's not his job. His job is to look at what the president of Russia does or the president of Bulgaria and say, that's not moral or that is moral. I congratulate you. Let's take a topic like abortion. Okay. Does the Pope go into the nations as the temporal authority and declare that, this government must disallow abortion? No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't write a letter to each president or whoever and tell them what to do. He makes proclamations from Rome, writes catechisms, writes encyclicals, and says it is wrong for anyone to commit abortion. That's it. That's all he does. So that's what we would expect from the Pope. So when he's doing exactly what Boniface VIII said in Unum Sanctum, which is he's using his spiritual authority to determine whether the temporal authority is acting in accord with the laws of God. That's it, period. But Joe Dyer makes it sound like the Pope's, he's just the cop on the beat, and he's got his hands everywhere, all over the world, because he's the temporal leader and he's in communication 24/7 with them about what to do, how to do it, and all kinds. No, it's just not the way it works. Okay. And it works the same way today. So it hasn't changed. What does the Pope do today? Well, we've had several of them who have condemned abortion in every way possible. Okay? And as a matter of fact, if the leader of the country doesn't listen to the Pope and still commits abortion, the Pope has the right to, if he's a Catholic, that is, which is very few, he has the right to excommunicate him. That's spiritual power, okay, over the temporal power. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know where Joe Dyer's going with this, but he's got an axe to grind against the papacy, and he's going to try to find a contradiction so that you'll get all flustered and worried, is it the true church? I've been following it, just a bunch of lies. That's what he wants you to think. Okay, but you're not. There is no contradiction. We're doing the same thing today that Boniface VIII did in his day. Now, look, there may have been popes who got on horses and carried a sword and thought that, they had to go stick it in somebody, their supposed enemy. Yeah, we've had those kinds of popes. Not many, but we've had them. But we're not here to guarantee the impeccability of the Pope, as we have always said. The Crusades, same thing. We're not here to exonerate the people that carried the sword and went and stuck it in some Muslims thinking that they were preserving Christianity. That's not what the dogmas taught. No dogma teaches that. The dogma just teaches that Christianity is the teacher of all nations, trying to teach them to live morally and with faith in God. And that's it. So if some pope oversteps his bounds, look, we've had some real humdingers as popes where the power just got to their head and they did all kinds of things that they shouldn't have done. Okay? But we're not here to defend their moral character. So you can't go in that direction. That's another straw man. Okay? And then the other place he goes is he starts to attack Vatican II documents like Dignitatis Humani and Nostra Aetate. They're the two straw men that get stood up the most, and they get beat up the most. And Jay does not do a very good job. He does not go into Dignitatis. He just mentions the name Dignitatis Humani. Well, now we have religious freedom, and the church didn't give religious freedom before. Bull. He ought to read Dignitatis Humani before he starts criticizing it. Okay? And they do the same with Nostra Aetate. I am just amazed at what theologians have gleaned from Nostra Aetate, especially in the area of the Jewish issues. People making claims that Nostra Aetate gave the Jews their own covenant and they're still the chosen people of God and all this stuff from Nostra Aetate doesn't say anything like that at all. But man, they want to see it. They want to see it because they want it to change, you see. But Nostra Aetate is not saying anything different than what was said before. It uses different words, but it's saying the same thing. And the same thing is true with Dignitatis Humani. Okay? It's not saying any. As a matter of fact, Dignitatis Humani starts out by saying, we're going to uphold the tradition dealing with this subject. Just to let you know that they know this is a little touchy subject. But they're going to stick to the tradition. They're just going to expand on it now and apply it to the modern world. That's all they're going to do. Okay. And if you read Dignitatis Humanae, it's not that long. 12 pages, maybe. It's one of the most beautiful documents the church has ever written. Let me say that to you again. Dignitatis Humanae is one of the most beautiful documents the church has ever written, as is Vatican II. Have you ever read all 16 documents of Vatican II? It's got some of the most beautiful language of the gospel that I've ever seen anywhere. Okay? But then you get these hot topics like religious freedom, and everybody just goes berserk because, oh no, the church is allowing all these other religions now. And, as a matter of fact, Dignitatis Humanae doesn't mention one other religion than the Catholic Church. Okay? All it talks is in the abstract about religious freedom. And the main reason why Dignitatis Humanae talks about religious freedom? Because it gives the Catholic Church the right to exist under governments that don't want it to exist. So the first thing the church says is, yes, we have the right to exist because we have religious freedom, and no government can coerce us not to have it or make laws that say we can't have it. So the first beneficiary of Dignitatis Humanae is the Catholic Church itself. Because if the Catholic Church doesn't have the right to exist with religious freedom, uncoerced and unbattled by its own government or any government that it's under, we don't have the Catholic religion. The governments will see to it that they snuff us out. And for 2,000 years, that's not been the case. Because every pope that's come along has told the government what their limits are. Your limits are to care for the people, but never to force them, never to coerce them to do things that you want them to do, which is against God and his plan, you see. So, and as a matter of fact, the coercion issue is paramount in Dignitatis Humanae because it mentions not being coerced probably, I would say, 10 times. 10 times. Using the word coercion. Saying that this is what we mean by religious freedom. That no one is coerced into accepting something against his conscience. And then she goes on and tells us in the rest of Dignitatis Humanae, the fathers, and it lists the fathers, all who said the same thing. Augustine, Ambrose, Clement III, Innocent III, all of them. It lists them. Footnote 7. In other words, we're not getting this out of thin air. This is what the church has taught. And why has she taught this? And what has she taught? That is, God gives every man the right to refuse or the right to accept freely, without any judgment upon them right at that moment, if they should choose, not to accept. God gives them patience. Now, they will be judged at the end of the world, that's for sure. Okay? But God does not force them to believe. He always, if you read the Gospels, God always gives them time and patience and the right to decide for themselves what they want. Now, they will pay the price if they choose the wrong thing, but God doesn't force them. Okay? Never will you find in the gospel that men are forced to accept. And any Catholic who thinks that the only way that we can get the whole world is we have to force them, make them walk in lockstep No, that's the last thing you want to do, because that's not the gospel, you see. So Mr. Dyer, his whole thesis is that somehow the church has changed her doctrine, wherein now we have freedom to decide what we want to do. We've always had the freedom. And then he talks about the syllabus of errors, or quanta cura, and another one. But they're not talking about the same thing. Okay? They're not talking about what Dignitatis Humanae is talking about. And if they are, Dignitatis Humanae is giving us the full picture of what they meant. Okay? The emphasis of the syllabus of errors by Pius IX is talking about, how can we put this? For men to think that because they have freedom, then they have the right, in the sense of, if you would say legal right or whatever right, to reject God and not pay any price for it. Okay? No, that is not the gospel. When we come to you and say, accept Jesus Christ as your Savior and your sins will be forgiven, we are giving them a choice, because in the dignity of being a human being, that's the way God made them. He made Adam and Eve that way. He didn't force them. He just said, don't eat this piece of fruit, and if in the day you do, you shall die. There's freedom, you see. And that's never been taken away, because man has been built that way. He's built in the image of God with freedom to make his own choice. Now, you pay the consequences of your choice, but you have the choice. Okay? And this is why the predestination of free will debate has been such a difficult issue. Because look at what weight the church, look at what weight God is putting on man's free will. It all depends on you, is what he's telling Adam. Weal or woe, take your pick. Okay? You have that. And God's never going to take it away from you. This is the whole reason why we're not Calvinists. Calvinists believe that once Adam fell, then he is totally depraved. He has no free will. It's over. No, sorry, that's not right. Still has a free will. That's Catholic doctrine. Okay? And that's why Calvin's understanding of predestination is all screwed up, because he starts out on the wrong foot of man being totally depraved with no free will after Adam sins. Okay? Not the Catholic Church. You'll never find that teaching there. Okay? He has free will. And if he has free will, he has freedom. He has his own responsibility. But I suggest that you read Dignitatis Humanae. As I said, one of the greatest documents put out by Vatican II. There should be no controversy about this document at all. You know, there's a excuse me. There is a tendency among the more religiously esteemed of us, the more religious knowledge of us, those of us who have more religious knowledge, to become very Pharisaical. I shouldn't say very Pharisaical, to become Pharisaical. Because knowledge breeds pride unless you control it. And pride breeds this contempt for others, wherein they're not saved, but we're saved. And we in that kind of mentality have a tendency to judge them too harshly and don't give them room. And one of them is the dignity that they deserve as a human being, to have the power from God to make their own decisions. And we tend to think that because they don't make the decisions to come to Christ, that somehow we have the responsibility to make them that way, or to and take away any religious freedom that they have, so that they are further condemned in that sense. I don't know if I'm saying that exactly correctly, but we always have to be aware of that Pharisaical kind of mentality where we think we're the only one saved. Okay? That can be a very dangerous territory. As 1 Timothy 2:4 says, God desires all men to be saved. Now, that's either true or it's false. There's no in between. And if it's true, then our boy Augustine here struggled with this too. Because when you get into that predestination area, you tend to think it's all wrapped up and there's really no more room for anybody. But 1 Timothy 2:4 insists up until the judgment day that God desires all men to be saved. And so what do you do that if you're a staunch predestinarian? Well, you're going to have some trouble. Yeah, because you're going to say that, well, God's will can't be frustrated. He's got it all worked out, man. It's all predestined. Okay, so if you can't frustrate God's will, then you can't take 1 Timothy 2:4 at face value, because that leaves it wide open, that verse. God desires all men to be saved now and till the end of time. There's no talk about predestination there, is there? Okay. It's a fact. God desires all men to be saved. Well, they're not all are saved. So is God's will frustrated? Well, gee, how do we work that out? You see, that's not going to fit into our metaphysics. Like, God's got it all worked out. So how can his will be frustrated? I mean, is God going to allow his will to be frustrated when he works all things out? I mean, how does that work? You should see the discussions about that one verse. See, this is what God does. You think you got it all sewed up, and God comes along and trips you up. No, you don't got it sewed up. You're not quite there yet, buddy. Okay. And then, a guy like John Calvin will come along and say, yeah, doesn't he have it all sewed up? So how are we going to dilute this verse, 1 Timothy 2:4? God desires all men to be saved. How do we dilute that to fit into our little, picture that we've made here that we think is all tightened up and bolted down and nobody can touch it? Well, here's how we do it. We say, God desires all kinds of men to be saved. You see, not all men, obviously, because they're not all saved. So all kinds, doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs, Italians, Jews, Russians, all kinds of men. He picks from each category. Really? It's amazing that he got away with that. explanation. But what else are you going to do? There's no other explanation you can give it. If you're going to, side with, God's will can't be frustrated kind of thing. Okay? So Augustine himself had 4 different interpretations of that passage at 4 different times in his life. Okay? So, like I said, we're not dealing with easy subjects here. But when you get to that point where you sort of lock salvation up to your little group, we're the only ones who are saved, and all these people, even though they're Catholics, they believe this or that. Well, they're not saved, obviously. That's what we get into. And, that's exactly where the devil wants you to go. That's what he wants you to do. So, anyway, back to Joe Dyer. Joe, I'm sorry, you didn't do a good job. Okay, you're fighting a straw man of your own choosing, and you ain't going to win that way. Okay, so all right, let me see what else we got here. Oh my gosh, it's 4:00 already. Hang on, people. Could you please explain once more Romans 11:25-29 and why this would not apply to a mass conversion of the Jews? Okay, so people get tripped up by the word all, where it says all Israel shall be saved. And the way it's introduced in the Greek is so all Israel shall be saved. The word so is the Greek hutos, which is an adverb. Okay. And why do you use the word so? Because it's making a conclusion from the previous verses. And what do the previous verses say? Do they talk about some mass conversion of the Jews? No. As a matter of fact, they do just the opposite. Okay? If you look at verses 1 of Romans 11 to verse 25, there's nothing there that even hints that there's going to be a mass conversion of the Jews. So when Paul then uses, so all Israel shall be saved, there's nothing of mass conversion to connect it to. So all there can't be a mass conversion of the Jews. And why would you even want that? Think about it. Why would you favor one generation of Jews at or near the end of time, and the adherents can't tell us when it's going to be? They've had discussions about this because, once Augustine accepted amillennialism that didn't have a future 1,000 years, there was no place to put the Jews. At least the early fathers who believed in premillennialism believed that there was going to be a 1,000-year time for the Jews, alone with Christ. Okay, as the Jews as the rulers of the world. Yeah, a few of our fathers had believed that. And then, there were a few fathers that believed in amillennialism too, which is there ain't no future 1,000 years. We're in it right now. Yeah. From the cross to the second coming is the millennium. Okay. So if the millennium comes to an end and that's the last day, then what room do you have for the Jews? It's not like premillennialism where they had 1,000 years. Okay. So, and Augustine never answered the question. He knew he had a problem. Because if he wanted to keep the mass conversion of the Jews, he had no place to put them. And so he equivocates back and forth between, it's going to happen a little before Jesus comes back, and then it's going to happen when Jesus comes back. Well, which is it? Okay? Well, you can see the difficulty he's having. And that is he doesn't have a millennium to put him in. Okay? So that raises the question. Why would you even want a mass conversion of Jews in the first place? Especially when, Paul's telling us throughout the whole chapter that the Jews, since the time of Abraham, have not believed. And you only have a remnant who believe, from him all the way through Elijah, all the way through Paul, and all the way to today, because we don't see masses of Jews converting. The most we've ever seen was at Pentecost, where we had 3,000 Jews convert in one day. And then the next chapters tell us there's a few more thousand and a few more. And then Luke finally just stops counting and just says there's a multitude. Says that several times. So by the time you get to, let's say, Acts 12, there's probably about 25,000 Jewish converts in Jerusalem. And that's it. That's the most we've ever had. And for some reason, they stopped converting, at least by the numbers that they were converting before. And Paul says it's so bad, there's such a dearth of Jewish conversions, that I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And of course, this was all prophesied by Scripture. See, God's mapped it all out, saw it all, he says. And and that's where we've been. So by the time he's writing Romans, there's a dearth of Jewish conversions. And so he begins Romans and says, he starts in Romans 9 and 10, and he tells of all the bad things that the Jews were doing. And in Romans 9, for example, he says in verse 31 and 32 that the Jews weren't saved because they tried to get it through works without faith. It says it clear as day. They tried to get it through their works. In other words, they tried to say, God, here, I did my work, you owe me salvation. Okay? So after he goes through all these exploits of the Jews, he comes to Romans 11, verse 1, and he says, can the Jew be saved? I mean, with all that stuff that God judged them through 2,000 years, can they still be saved? And the answer comes back, yes. Look at me. I'm saved. I'm a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, all right, so Jews can still be saved. But what has the history shown us? Well, then he goes and he talks about the time that they were in Elijah's day. And he says, what happened back then? Well, here's a nation, 800 BC, that has probably between 5 and 10 million people. Okay? And he only finds 7,000 that are saved. That's it. 7,000 out of 5 or 10 million people? That's like 0.014%. Yeah, well, that's what happened, he says. As a matter of fact, all the other ones, they had their chance to be saved, and they didn't want it because they wanted to come to it by their works, and God said no. And so let them be blinded, he says in verse 7 and 8. Let them be blinded that they never see. And of course, that's what happened. Okay. So what I'm doing for here is I'm building the context so that when we get to verse 26 and it says, so all Israel shall be saved, you understand how now to interpret it because of what the context has taught you about what it meant or what it means. You see. And then so when he goes to verse 11, said, let them be blinded, blah, 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 blah. And then he talks about, but I still want to save the Jews. I want to make them jealous by calling the Gentiles. And he says, for what purpose? In verse 14, he says, to save some of them. Some. And that means a little. Doesn't mean a whole lot. Because that's what the context had already told us. I want to say, even if he can make them jealous, he says, I want to save some of them. So he's conditioning his own results. You see, it doesn't say all of them. It says some. And that is the Greek word some. Just to let you know. And then he talks about the olive tree and how the Jews have been cut off from the olive tree and the Gentiles have been grafted in. And here's one of the most important verses that most people miss. Verse 23. It says, but they can be regrafted into their own tree if they will believe. Okay, so they're not grafted into the tree right now, but they can be regrafted just like the Gentiles were grafted in if they will believe. So here you have another condition. It's not going to be automatic. Okay? It's not going to be like God's going to, sprinkle down some fairy dust and all the Jews are going to be saved. No. Verse 23 says, if they will believe. And where have you heard that before? Huh? Yeah, to everybody who receives the gospel, if you will believe. And how many do? Whether Jew or Gentile. Not many. Okay? For some odd reason. And so and he talks about the hardness. This the hardness that come upon the Jews. Okay? And this will persist, he says, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Now, what can that mean? There's only one thing it can mean. Because this is a context talking about salvation. Nothing else. Nothing political. And the Gentile fullness is going to come, according to Luke 21:24, when Jesus comes back. Yeah, that's the only other time we see fullness of the Gentiles. So we know that means the end of the world, Jesus coming back. In other words, the hardness upon Israel, wherein most of them will not become saved because they refuse to believe, will occur up until the end of the world. That means it's going to be here continually. And what do we see? We see exactly that. Okay? They've been in their own land now for him. God's grace has allowed them to go back there. Okay? But what do we see? We see more blindness now than we did before. Okay? There's nothing there about Jesus Christ. All right? So we see the hardness continuing right up until the end. And then Paul comes in and says, so all Israel shall be saved. In what manner? That's what the Greek word hutos means. It's an adverb. In this manner, in this way, all Israel will be saved. What way is that? Well, he just showed us that there's only a remnant coming in. From the time of Elijah in the Old Testament, all the way to Paul, and all the way to the future. There's only going to be a remnant of Jews. Okay? And he says, and so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, out of Zion comes the deliverer, who will take away the sins of Jacob. Blah, 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 blah. He goes on. Well, what is that? Who's the deliverer? Nobody but Jesus Christ. He's the only person that can make a covenant and forgive sins of Jacob. And that's exactly what was prophesied before Jesus came. That he would make a new covenant with the house of Israel, which is Jacob. Okay? And he would forgive their sins. That's what Jesus did on the cross. So that's how the Jew is going to be saved, just like the Gentile is. by the redemption of Jesus Christ, who was prophesied in the Old Testament. And Paul picks two passages, Isaiah 59 and Isaiah 27, to verify that he's talking about Jesus Christ, the deliverer. Okay? So there's nothing in the context of Romans about some mass conversion of Jews. There's nothing in the New Testament about a mass conversion of Jews. Nothing, not one single word. All we get is a remnant of Jews that will be saved. And of course, that's what we get with the Gentiles too. Not all Gentiles are going to be saved either. Very few of them, a remnant, if we can be so bold. So that's why it's not talking about a mass conversion of Jews. Whoever promotes that kind of idea has to force it, because there's nothing in Scripture to teach that teaches it. Nothing. Okay? And if anybody would like to debate that little issue, let me know. All right. All right. So I got to let these go because there's three more of them here. And I'm giving them too much time already. So let me see what's up here. Okay. Can you give an estimate of when we can purchase a PDF from your website without having to pay shipping fees? Oh my gosh, is that happening? I don't know. I didn't put that together. I am responsible for it, so I have to do something about that. You're paying shipping fees. All right. I can plead innocence, but PDF shipping fees. All right. I'll see if I can get that fixed. Thank you for letting me know. All right. Why does the NRSV translate Genesis 1:2 as a wind from God instead of the Spirit of God, especially since the latter is proof of the Trinity in the Old Testament? Well, you stumbled into an area where talking about predestination and free will. You're going to get all kinds of opinions, okay? And unfortunately, translators they give themselves a lot of leeway, especially these days, with dynamic equivalence instead of word-to-word translations. Not to say that word for word is, always the best. It can be quite wooden sometimes, and you have to be careful with that. Because, you have to communicate to the reader. At the same time, you have to be faithful to the text. And that's a very hard job to do. Very, very hard job. And do it consistently. Okay? But see, the problem starts with the Hebrew word ruach, which means wind or spirit. Okay? That's where the problem starts. So you really can't damn the translator if he translates it as wind, because he thinks the context is, encouraging that kind of translation. Because, in the way it starts, it's in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving across the waters. Now, you've got water, you've got land, and what moves across the waters in the natural realm? Wind. Winds make the waves, right? So if you were interpreting it strictly as a natural physical phenomenon, wind would be your word. Okay. If you have an inkling that ruach in the Hebrew here means spirit, and by the way, this is the same thing with New Testament Greek. The word pneuma is wind or spirit. Okay. So this is why things can get a little tricky. And let's put it this way. We're not looking for true proof of the Trinity as the be all and end all of how we interpret Genesis 1-2. Okay, you can't get into the translation that way. You can't go by a theological idea that you think is good and now you want to impose that on the passage. Okay. You have to get the decision of translating it as spirit based on the context itself. Okay. And the word etymology, of course. But theological ideas, when you're translating grammatically and historically, theological ideas take somewhat of a back seat. Okay. And are only brought into the picture if they fit contextually. Okay. Now, it just so happens, however, in this instance, that spirit does seem to fit in contextually. Okay. Because you first have, in the beginning, God created. Okay. So what the text has done is it has imposed God into the text. It doesn't say, in the beginning, everything was created. It says God created, subject, verb. Okay. And so, especially now in the rest of verse 2, because you want you a sense that there is movement now on the water that is being, how should I say, that like the Spirit stirring up the water, more or less. Okay. Even like in Luke, when it talks about the man who had a disease for 38 years, and people used to go into the pool of Siloam and get cured. It says the angel would come and stir the water up first so that everybody knew that it was time now to go in and get healed. I mean, that's a little crude, but something could be happening like that where the Spirit's stirring the water. It's hovering, and the Hebrew word that's used there is a special word, okay, not an ordinary word. It says the Spirit is hovering, and that word is used in Deuteronomy 32, I forget the verse, where it says God hovers over the people, okay? And there's other passages like that. God hovers over you like an eagle hovers over you. So that's the word that's chosen there. So that, again, that's going to make us think, okay, maybe it's more than wind here, because the wind doesn't hover like a mother does over chicks, but the Spirit does. Okay, so it's hovering, and then it's going to do something. Okay, and that's all basically what Genesis 1 is about, is a development of the creation, just one thing coming after another, you see. So we have this progression forward, and the Spirit is more or less moving it along, let's say. Okay. And then, of course, you have the last part of verse 3 says, and God said, let there be light. So here's further development. Okay. So there you go. That's what you run into. Okay. What was or is the third secret of Fatima? The best way for you to get a hold of that or understand that is well, maybe I can do both. I have a book out that you should get if you're interested in this. It's called Fatima, Fulfilled but Still Foreboding. Okay? In other words, the first and second secret are fulfilled, and part of the third secret's fulfilled, but not all of it. And that's the foreboding part. So, the parts that fulfilled is in 1930 or 29, Our Lady came to our Sister Lucia and told her to tell Pius the 11th that now is the time for the consecration to be done. Consecration of Russia. Okay. So Pius XII approved her miracle that she saw the Blessed Virgin, or Our Lady, we call her, at that time in 1929. And so he committed himself to it. But guess what? He never did the consecration. So he sat on his hands for 10 years, which is a puzzle for this normally understood good man who even wrote an encyclical about Our Lady. 1937, he just didn't move like he was supposed to move. And God didn't like this too much. So Jesus got in on the act, let's say, and came to him and told him, you need to do the consecration. And he still didn't do it. And then Jesus came again in 1936 and told Sister Lucia that the consecration needed to be done, and Pius XI still didn't do it. And then he died, and Pius XII took over in 1939, and this is still weighing heavy on Sister Lucia's heart. So she approaches Pius XII rather timidly, but still approaches him. Actually, by this time, she's getting more strength because she just was beside herself with the delay that Pius XI had given her for 10 years. And so the goal now was to encourage, let's say, Pius XII to do it. And he had the same reservations that Pius XI had, political, you say. In the back door, these guys were trying to make friends with the Russians. And that was a no-no. Okay? And men get tempted like this. God tells them one thing, and the enemy is there with the sword ready to pounce on them if they obey God, and they get scared. And they think the best thing to do is to appease them. No. That's the worst thing you can do. That's because that's exactly what they want. So they can have more time to do their dirty work. Okay? So in order to get Pius XII to do the consecration, Sister Lucia teams up with Father Consalves. And he's pretty astute priest. He thinks he knows how to get to Pius XII. And they both do eventually. Okay. So Sister Lucia starts writing letters, and they're read by Father Consalvus to make sure everything's right. And the letter gets to him, Pius XII, and Sister Lucia says you need to do the consecration. No ands, ifs, or buts, as politely as she can. And she did. She wrote pretty politely, as was her nature. And Pius XII says he can't because of the situation he's in. And so they come back and say, okay, let's do this. Pius XII wants to consecrate the world, okay, for some odd reason. And Sister Lucy comes back and says, all right, let's do this. We'll let you consecrate the world to Russia. Consecrate the world, and then just name Russia after you're done the consecration of the world as having a special, I don't know what they called it, special mention of Russia to coincide with what heaven had requested originally, that you consecrate Russia. And so Sister Lucia goes back to Jesus, and he says, yeah, okay, we'll do that. You can consecrate the world and have a special mention of Russia at the end. But here's what I'm going to do if you do that. And you see the freedom that Jesus gives them? Here's what you're going to, the promise that I gave you is going to be diluted. So the peace that was going to come, well, that's going to not come for 2.5 more years because you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You didn't do what heaven originally told you to do. Because Pius XII was originally told, consecrate Russia, period. So now he's coming back with this, weaker, well, I'll consecrate the world and I'll just mention Russia. He says, yeah, okay, Jesus says. But you didn't realize that once you change the parameters, I'm going to change my parameters. So the war's going to go on for 2.5 more years. And that's going to be on your shoulders. Okay. And the conversion of Russia that you would have expected right away, that's not going to come for a while. That's not going to come until the future. So, and Pius XII had already committed himself now. Okay. So Sister Lucy comes back and tells him, okay, you can consecrate the world and mention Russia at the tail end, but here's what Jesus says. That's going to happen now. And she told him, and I guess he's trembling in his boots now. I don't know. But he does consecrate the world. Okay. And what happens? Well, the war goes on for 2.5 more years until 1945, just like Jesus said. That's the price you're going to pay for not obeying heaven. Okay? And then the conversion of Russia, Jesus doesn't even give a time element for that. He just says it's going to happen in the future. Okay? And it's taken us what? How many years? 50, 60, 70 years to see Russia change from atheism to accepting Christianity in their constitution in 1993. Yeah, that's a pretty big change. Okay. So, and don't listen to all the hype from the West about Russia. Russia's a lot better than what you're led to believe. Believe me. All you have to do is read the statistics. Compare those statistics in Russia with what you see happening in the United States, and you'll see which one is the healthier. and more godly nation. Okay? So heaven did its job. And that's why we don't have World War III hanging over our head, at least the way we did back in the Cold War. So that's the third secret. Okay? So anyone more detail about it? And there is a secret actually that was given to Sister Lucia, and that's in the book as well. And I use what I know from all the Fatima, events to give an interpretation of that secret. And let me just tell you, if you're looking for some kind of, secrets here or there, that nobody else knows, you're not going to find it. Okay. The third secret's not written like that. It's written in very broad, general language, and we can apply it to things that have happened in the 20th century and what we expect in the future based on the gospel. And, there's really not much to it. Okay. So don't try to get sensational about it. But I suggest you pick up the book. All right. Question: is sacramental confession sufficient for forgiveness of sin? I'm not sure why you're asking that, Laura. Of course it is. Any sin, mortal, venial, or anywhere in between. No, I don't want to say that. Yes, why wouldn't it not be? I don't understand why you would ask that. So, sorry if I can't go into any more depth. All right. Have you read anything about Our Lady of Revelation, the apparition in Fontaine? No, I haven't. So if you want to bring something to me to look at, I'll be happy to answer that for you next time. Okay. Question: is there punishment of sins forgiven? Yes. This is even true in the Old Testament. Okay, certainly true today. When David committed adultery with Bathsheba and he killed her husband, Uriah, David's life was never the same because he was punished severely. Now, he was forgiven and his eternal life was preserved, okay, but he was punished like you wouldn't believe. His daughters were raped, his newborn son was taken from him. You don't want to go in that direction, okay? So, yeah, so to answer your question, yeah, you can be punished for your sin even though you're forgiven, okay? All right. You can continue dreams like pressing the unpause button. I'll remember that next time, Seamus. Have you read anything about apparitions of Our Lady of... okay, somebody already asked that. How can anyone go straight to heaven if we all have sinned? Well, because if you're in a state of grace, okay, and you have taken care of all the punishment that is due your sins, which you can do through indulgences, okay, that's why the church gives them free grace. Take advantage of any indulgence that you get. You believe me, they're keeping a record of them in heaven. Okay. And if all that punishment has been taken care of and you're in a state of grace without mortal or venial sin, you can go to heaven. No problem. Okay. That's an incentive, as a matter of fact. I always joke that I'm not going to go to purgatory, okay? Because I'm going to take advantage of all the indulgences, and I want to make sure that all my punishment's been adjudicated. And so, all right, let's try another one here. Question. During Mass, I notice hosts from the tabernacle are distributed. How do we know they're consecrated? Pardon the odd question, but since my reversion, I've developed an odd attention to detail. Well, doctor, they would not be put in the tabernacle unless they were consecrated. Okay? Because the tabernacle is going to store unused hosts. That's why we can go there and worship, because those hosts are still in the tabernacle. Okay? So that's the reason. All right, let's go through these here. Dear Robert, would you consider dinosaurs as evolutionist myth with no existence in the Bible, and the bones belong to the extinct phoenix bird confirmed by the fathers and named Zez Shaddai in the Hebrew Bible? I assume that's a Zion because it's kind of small. Zion, Yod, Zion, Shin, Dalet, Yod. No, not a myth. There were big animals. Okay, that's pretty clear in the paleontological records. But we have good reason why they died out, because the climate changed drastically after the flood, went down at least 10 degrees. And the dinosaur there was enough food being made for the dinosaurs. These guys eat all day long. And if there's not enough plants, there's not going to be enough dinosaurs, and they're going to get extinct, which is what happened. Now, smaller creatures like animals and us, we're not going to eat 1/10 as much as a dinosaur does. So we have survivability, and there's not many of us, to start out. There's only 8 of us after the flood, so we've got some building to go. The dinosaurs, they grow pretty fast, and we had baby dinosaurs in the ark. I don't know how many. We probably only needed 1 pair, but then they would multiply and proliferate all over the land surface, and at a pretty fast pace. Some of them were egg layers. So you have many eggs at a time, so they could multiply pretty fast. But then after a while, let's say a few hundred years, the climate's not supporting them, which is probably good, because as the human population is going to grow, you don't want the dinosaur population to grow. You want that to decrease, because we don't want to have to be competing with dinosaurs who have the upper hand because of their size. Okay. Dealing with tigers and lions and bears, that's enough. We don't need animals that are 10 times as big as them. So it's good that they actually died out. Now, I don't know where you're getting this Hebrew name here. The phoenix bird? I don't think so. Sorry, I don't mean to dismiss it, willy-nilly here, but anytime I heard of the phoenix bird is from myths. That's it. So, okay. Why was the index of prohibited books done away with, and why was Nietzsche never put on the index? That is a good question. That is something I wish they had not done. It started in 1542 under Pius V, was it? The Index of Forbidden Books. And it was very good. It's very good. This is when the church was in its flower. Um, the Index of Forbidden Books is a good indicator of where the church is because that, I forget what year it stopped. It's in the 1800s. I think it was the late 1880s, was it? Not sure. I need to check up on that. Nietzsche was, you know, he was, I think, after the index had stopped. So he wasn't going to be put on the index, nor were any of his Marxist pals either. So, yeah. Now, something's telling me that it could have been in the 1900s that the index was stopped. I'm a little fuzzy on that, so I got to check it. Let me make a note here. Well, you know, for that matter, Isaac Newton wasn't put on the index, and that was 1687. Okay, Kepler was Johannes Kepler. He was put on it early because he came a lot earlier than Newton, of course. But Newton was never put on it. But you know, so by that time, that whole geocentric issue was topsy turvy. So that may have been one reason why. I don't know. All right, let's go to the next one. In your review of Heschmeyer's debate, you suggested Malachi 1:11 was not a good argument because of the present tense versus future tense. But the Hebrew suggests the context is future. Continued per Malachi 3 and in Malachi otherwise. Am I reading it wrong? If you're saying that Malachi 3:11 is future, yes, because it's not. There's no verb there. Okay. There's no verb there, so you can't imply one. You can't infer one. You have to take the passage as it comes to you, and that passage is all present tense. Okay, it's the nations now that are offering sacrifice. Odd as that may seem. Okay, I forget what is sacrifice, or the bird offering or something. That's what the nations are doing, and the reason it has to be now, I mean, in the present tense, is because God is using that as a goad against the Jews who are not giving him the proper sacrifices. So in other words, he's saying, look, you have all these animal sacrifices, all kinds of sacrifices that I've given you to to appease me and appease me for your sins and blah, blah, blah. And the Gentiles, who don't even have, hardly any of the sacrifices you have, they're right now sacrificing to me. Because, the whole idea of sacrifice is like men know they need to sacrifice to God. The same reason they know they need to worship God. Because as Paul says in Romans 1:18-20, God instilled that in them. His eternal existence and the fact that he is the judge, he's instilled that in them so that they know that they have to worship God. Nobody has to tell them. Okay? So you find these Gentiles, at the same time you find the Jews, they're offering sacrifices to God. Okay? That's all that context wants to say. And if you try to make it where it's prophesying a future priesthood and all this, it's just going to fall apart. Okay, it's just not in the cards. Okay, at the least, I would be very careful if I was going to do something like that, because if you're going to go by the words that are used in the text, you're not going to get anything in the New Testament that's going to correlate with it. The only thing you're going to get to correlate with it is the idea of sacrifice. That's it. And that's just not strong enough to make Malachi 1:11 a prophecy. All right. Now, this is not to say that Malachi doesn't have any prophecy in it. It's just saying if you're going to be in a debate on the Mass and you're saying the Mass is prophesied in the Old Testament, in other than Exodus or Leviticus being sacrificial paradigms that match the sacrificial paradigm we have in the New Testament, everybody can accept that, even though the Levitical priesthood is not the forerunner of Jesus's priesthood at all. Okay, and that's another thing you run into with Malachi 1:11, I think it is, if I remember correctly, or is that Isaiah 26? But it says in Isaiah 26, I will get Levites for me to be the priests. That's not going to fit either, because the Levites are not the forerunners of Catholic priests. Okay? Only the order of Melchizedek is the forerunner of New Testament priests. So God can't be calling Levites in the future. Got to be calling them in the present. Okay? All right. That's the way I see it. Hey, Dr. Jonathan. Nice to see you again. All right. I heard you saying in a debate that open theism must be examined and has some good points. Do you still believe that, and why? Yes, I do, because it's one of those areas, again, like predestination and free will, okay, wherein somebody who believes in the predestinarian side more than he does the free will side, more or less boxes God in. And like Thomas says, it's all cause and effect. It's all calculated out. The prime mover pushes, and then that pushes something else, and that pushes something else, and it's all calculated out. Okay. Well, that's the opposite of open theism. Okay. Open theism is trying to make room. Now, they may be doing not so good of a job at it. I don't know. But the idea is that you can't confine God to a box or a calculation, because then you make God the product of his own calculation, and he has no free will, you see. The free will versus predestination argument is even bigger than God and man, because you eventually have to get back to God himself and ask the question, is God a determined being, or does he have free will? So that nothing is so cut and dry where we can say that it's determined. And that's where the Thomists want to take you, that it's determined, and we're just following the breadcrumbs, so to speak. Although there is good to that. I understand, where they're coming from, because they don't want anything from the outside, messing up the work, so to speak. But on the other hand, look, this is not a God you can confine and say he has to follow the Aristotelian cause and effect, and he has no room outside of that. Okay, once you start confining God into Aristotelian metaphysics, you're going to have problems. Okay, because the church has said 4 times in its teachings, official teachings, that God is not determined. God is free. Now that has to mean something. It's not just words. that means God could do this or that or the other thing. Okay. And then it confines the issue to creation. It says, was God forced to create? Now, why would it ask that question? Well, because if everything's calculated out, cause and effect, Aristotelian metaphysics, God sort of got to follow his own path, right? How can he deviate it if he's already thought it out? Well, the church says he does have that freedom. Okay. And the example he uses is he did not have to create. He decided to create. And what do you decide from? You decide from your free will, don't you? The minute you talk about decisions means you're talking about a free will. So, you got to be real careful. And the open theism concept is saying, yeah, we got a God who's got freedom to choose one or the other. And if he chooses one, it doesn't mean the other one's bad necessarily, right? God could be debating between two good things. And you could put to create or not to create as the two good things. Because if God didn't create, do you think he'd be any unhappier than he was prior? No, because God's perfect in himself. He doesn't need anything. Okay, so he doesn't need us. As a matter of fact, somebody might ask the question, well, why would God create, considering that he's going to take a big risk? And things might not go the way he planned, in the sense that, Adam sinned and now we have to have a contingency plan. Why go through all that sorrow? Well, there's something bigger in God. Okay, maybe the love is going to be the motivator of why he decides to create. We don't exactly know. We can have an idea. And I thought about this myself. And that's the only place where I would end up, is because of the love of God. So that's why, the opposite of open theism, of course, would be, Calvinism, where everything is, sewed up into a little, nice little box and fits all together so well. At least they think it does. And these are the very people that actually have problems putting their whole system together, because it has holes all over the place that, they can't see because they're blinded to it. But I'm not endorsing the current teachings on open theism, but I'm telling you that the concept of a open, free God, okay, has to be dealt with just as much as the determined metaphysical idea of God, okay? And where those two meet, who knows? But, okay, let's see. We've got 3 more minutes left. Do churches outside of the Catholic Church have valid consecration of the Eucharist? Well, the Orthodox do. Okay. And we used to say that the Anglicans do, but I don't know if that's true anymore. I'm not positive. But yeah, there is the Orthodox have it. That's the hurting point, is because the Orthodox have the sacraments, because they have the priesthood. And yet they're outside the Catholic Church. They're in schism. Okay, that hurts. All right, question. St. Pio had the stigmata in his hands. The Shroud of Turin. Historical medical consensus is that crucifixion would have been in the wrist. How to reconcile this difference? Well, I've done some study on that myself. It's not conclusive that it's from the wrist. Okay. There is much evidence that it could be in the palm of the hand, especially the way the Romans supported the body. You see, they wanted you to bleed and have pain. Okay. They didn't. And the best way to do that is to prop you up a little bit and have you feel the pain and not be ripped from the cross. Okay. These guys were sadistic sometimes. So, yeah. And then there's been other medical studies that show that if you put it in the proper place, and the Romans knew how to do that in the palm of the hand, as long as the weight wasn't, too heavy, the palm could support it. So that's still an open question. Okay. And then the last time I studied that was probably about 10 years ago, but I do remember that. Question: what do you think about the upcoming canonization of Carlo Acutis? I don't know. I don't know about him. So I just can't say anything. Okay, it looks like that's it. All right, good, people. I got down pretty far on this list. And so we will see you next week, which would be what, April the 9th. And hope you're enjoying the nice weather. And what else did I want to say? I'm trying to find my website. I have to type that in, I think. Okay, so if you want any books or DVDs or things of that sort, go to robertsongenis.org or .com or .net, all work. And for the science stuff, you can go to journeytothecenteroftheuniverse.com. And we'll have all kinds of goodies there for you. I don't know when they're going to get the conference that we had last Saturday up, but you will be the first to know once we do that. And what else? Nothing else. I can't think of it anyway. So thank you for coming and staying with me, bearing with me for 2 hours. You're a glutton for punishment. And we'll see you again on the 9th from 3 to 5. Bring your friends, enemies, relatives, and we'll have a good time together. All right. God bless you. Take care.